أعلن افتتاح جلسة
The 8,992nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is briefing by the Chairperson in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. His Excellency, Mr. Zbigniew Rau, Chairperson in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland, and Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Zbigniew Rau.
Mr. President, Madam Under Secretary General, distinguished Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by stressing how much I value the continued dialogue between the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the United Nations. The OEC, in line with Chapter 8 of the UN Charter, stands ready to continue its cooperation and coordination with the United Nations. Our organizations share the same goal of strengthening international peace, security, and promoting respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the universal rules-based order. Such a close cooperation is even more needed today when the basic principes of the UN Charter and international law are being flagrantly violated in the very heart of Europe. I address you today with a sense of urgency and moral imperative to make every possible effort to stop the military aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. The OEC was designed as a platform to diffuse tensions, facilitate dialogue, reduce the risk of military escalation, and prevent conflicts. Since the very beginning of the Polish chairmanship, my goal has been to seek compromise and facilitate dialogue between parties of conflict. We took over our role in the context of growing tensions stemming from Moscow's unilateral demands of security guarantees. The basic premise of these demands was fundamentally flawed. The transatlantic community is neither enemy nor threat to Russia or its people. On the contrary, the West has always sought to establish an effective framework of cooperation with Moscow. Despite our reservations, we offered Russia a forum to discuss within the OEC all its possible concerns related to European security. We are we were ready to consider, in good faith, new avenues of cooperation on one condition: that they would contribute to stability and security in the Oesc area. This initiative complemented the bilateral track of the US-Russia dialogue and the discussions in the NATO-Russia Council. Russia had a full spectrum of options to engage peacefully and diplomatically to address its concerns. But Russia was just buying time. Its continued military build-up on Ukrainian borders caused serious doubts about Moscow's real intentions. In the morning of February the 24th, the worst-case scenario became reality. The unprovoked, unjustified, and premeditated full-scale aggression shattered our convictions that the horror of war in Europe belonged to the past. The perverse attempts by the Russian side to justify the military operation against a sovereign and peaceful country made a cruel joke out of the UN Charter and Helsinki Final Act. This operation, poorly prepared and executed, turned out to be a strategic and tactical failure. But instead of preventing further unnecessary deaths in its own ranks, the Kremlin changed its tactics. The invading force started to target the civilian population and infrastructure in an attempt to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. This is deplorable and shameful and amounts to state terrorism. Schools, hospitals, and kindergartens are deliberately being targeted with internationally banned weapons. The reports of women and children killed and wounded are devastating. It is if Geneva Conventions and humanitarian law never existed. Make no mistake about it, the international community has instruments and means to hold responsible those who commit and are complicit in war crimes. I have been recently accused by the Russian officials of the lack of impartiality in conducting my job as the OSCE chairman in office. I have only one response to this kind of allegations. The impartiality ends where blatant violation of international and humanitarian law starts. In moments like these, it is our moral obligation to maintain decency and integrity. The perpetrators will be judged by their deeds, but we will be judged by the way we respond to these horrors. We cannot stay indifferent. Let me quote Elie Wiesel, who at the turn of the new millennium famously said, "Indifference is always the friend of the enemy, for it benefits the aggressor, never his victim, whose pain is magnified when he or she feels forgotten. The political prisoner in his cell, the hungry children, the homeless refugee, not to respond to their plight, not to relieve their solitude by offering them a spark of hope, is to exile them from human memory. And in defying their humanity, we betray our own. It is Russia, supported by the Belarusian regime, that has decided to act outside the parameters and boundaries of international law. And unfortunately, it is the Russian leadership that provokes the growing isolation of the country and the Russian people from the world. The international community has rightly condemned Russia's invasion and called on Moscow to withdraw its forces from Ukraine. The world is not looking away. It is hard to ignore 141 countries assembled in the UN General Assembly asking Mr. Putin to stop this war. We are also sending a strong signal to Minsk not to participate in this cruel endeavor. The war is against the interests of the Russian and Belarusian people and leads only to isolation. We expect the Russian side to honor its international obligations and commitments. Any sustainable political solution must fully respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The door to diplomacy is still open, and I call on Russia to engage in a meaningful and substantial dialogue to seek a peaceful solution to the current crisis. Mr. President, distinguished ambassadors, Russia's aggression threatens the very existence of OSCE. Its non-compliance with OSCE principles and commitments poses questions not only about the future of the organization, but also about stability of the rules-based order. How effective can we be if one of the major stakeholders has repeatedly justified the use of force to win territorial and political concessions? This logic fundamentally clashes with the norms that we all have agreed to abide by. The OSCE is not a treaty-based international organization, but it is very much embedded in the context of multilateral diplomacy. For almost 50 years, it has been an instrument to advance peaceful cooperation based on comprehensive security. Given the inclusive character of the organization, I still believe that it is the right platform for dialogue and peaceful resolution of conflicts. The OSCE has become more than just a talk shop between East and West. It has a solid work record and a multi-layer outreach. Its presence plays a stabilizing role in diverse regions such as the Western Balkans and Central Asia. In my capacity as the OSCE chair, I will pay visits to Moldova, South Caucasus, as well as the Western Balkans and Central Asia to prove OSCE's engagement with the participating states. This legacy is still relevant in today's world. However, the future of the organization depends on how effectively we will be able to revive cooperation among all participating states. The question is how to reach consensus around the main priorities and how to create a proper modus operandi to fulfill the OEC mandate. I have to admit that this non-compliance with OEC's principles is forcing us to put on hold or delay some of the issues important for the daily operation of the organization. Will we be able to achieve progress on regional and protracted conflicts when trust has been shattered? I very much hope so, but it will require acting in good faith on the part of all parties, including Russia. The same applies to the renewed European security dialogue, which the Polish chair initiated in response to growing tensions. Supported by an overwhelming majority of the participating states, it was meant to develop new measures of trust, transparency, and confidence. Unfortunately, despite initial interest, the Russian side has chosen the most destructive path of confronting its concerns, fears, and misgivings. The changing situation on the ground will probably determine the scope and character of the future engagement of a special monitoring mission in Ukraine. Acknowledging the mission's 8 years of operation and its expertise, I will work with the OEC structures and participating states to utilize its potential in the future. I hope that both the mission-dedicated staff as well as the team of the OEC project coordinator in Ukraine will be able to continue the important mission. During the Polish chairmanship, we will initiate and actively support efforts to advance the OEC's goals. We do not want to alter the fundamental premise of the OEC cooperation based on agreement by all participating states. However, we would like to increase the effectiveness of the organization, provided that there is a broader interest and support for the majority of the stakeholders. The recent events in Ukraine have once again shone a spotlight on the situation of civilian population in conflict-affected areas. We will continue to call on all sides of military conflicts to abide by humanitarian law and to refrain from activities directed against civilian population and infrastructure. The OEC stands ready to cooperate closely with UN humanitarian agencies to facilitate and provide the necessary assistance. This must also include creating effective evacuation routes for the civilian population. Whenever there are reliable accounts of humanitarian law abuse, we should be ready to react swiftly. Therefore, we welcome the decision of the Permanent Council of March the 3rd to invoke the Moscow mechanism to create a group of independent experts to investigate the reported violation of humanitarian law in the context of the hostilities in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, I am convinced that the Oesc needs strong and effective leadership now more than ever before. The dramatic events in Ukraine have opened our eyes to the need for a renewed commitment to the Oesc principles and commitments. It is true that Oesc may evolve as a result of the current experience. The celebrations of the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act could turn out to be dedicated to finding a solution for the deep crisis of multilateralism. Peace and security, like freedom and democracy, cannot be taken for granted. We have learned this lesson the hard way. But it is also true that those who choose to embark on a path of military confrontation receive very little in return. Between war and peace, life and destruction, we should always be able to look beyond our narrow, narcissistic instincts. What alternative do we have? Smoldering ashes of Kiev, Kharkiv, and Mariupol, and thousands of innocent lives lost are a stark reminder of the heavy price that we pay for indifference in the face of brute force. It is therefore high time for the international community, for the United Nations, as well as for the Oesc, to reinforce our efforts to restore peace and revert to our principles and values. The integrity of international law and stability of the world order are at stake. Mindful of the immense challenges that we face, let us work together on the most effective ways to save lives and prevent future conflicts. Thank you.
أشكر معالي
I thank Mr. Rao for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, thank you for the invitation to join His Excellency Foreign Minister Rao to brief the Council on UN OSCE cooperation. The tragic conflict in Ukraine, which over the weekend has further worsened, vividly illustrates the importance of mechanisms to maintain and strengthen European and international peace and security. Born out of the Cold War, the OSCE has been at the center of efforts to bring its unique membership, spanning from Vancouver to Vladivostok, around one overarching goal: to resolve differences peacefully. In line with Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter, the OSCE works in complement to the UN, including to resolve conflicts in the region. In 1993, the UN and the OSCE established a cooperation framework. Since then, our partnership has grown in scope and substance to help address acute crises and find solutions to common peace and security challenges. Our shared commitment to preventive diplomacy, mediation, peace building, and the Women, Peace and Security agenda was reaffirmed through the joint declaration between the Secretary General and the Chairperson in office in 2019. The coordination and complementarity guiding our efforts translate into action in various ways. We work together in Central Asia, most recently to implement the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, in the Western Balkans to advance reconciliation, and in the Caucasus, where the UN co-chairs the Geneva International Discussions on Georgia, along with the OSCE and the EU. Further, the UN has sought to complement the OSCE's leading role to address protracted conflicts regarding Nagorno-Karabakh and Moldova. Regarding Ukraine, and pursuant to Security Council Resolution 2202 on the Minsk agreements, the UN has consistently supported the work of the OSCE, especially the Special Monitoring Mission and the OSCE-led Trilateral Contact Group, while carrying out our humanitarian and human rights mandates on the ground. I wish to pay tribute here to all OSCE staff for their important work accomplished under very challenging circumstances. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine is the most severe test the OSCE and related regional frameworks have faced since their creation. The Russian invasion has shaken the foundations of the European security architecture to its core. As we meet, the bloodshed continues to worsen. Russian forces have now launched deadly airstrikes in the west of Ukraine. Ukrainian cities are under unrelenting shelling and bombardment, with many civilians killed daily. As I said 3 days ago in this very chamber, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has received credible reports of Russian forces using cluster munitions, including in populated areas. Indiscriminate attacks, including those using cluster munitions, which are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilians or civilian objects without distinction, are prohibited under international humanitarian law. We are deeply disturbed by reports that Ukrainian municipal officials in Russian-controlled parts of the country have been abducted. There are also reports of civilians, including journalists, being targeted allegedly by Russian forces. Mr. President, we must not allow any questioning of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Such questioning would be inconsistent with the United Nations Charter and relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. Amid these dire conditions, the United Nations continues to scale up not only its humanitarian support to the people of Ukraine, but also its engagement with key partners like the OSCE in support of an immediate ceasefire and a lasting diplomatic solution. When the Secretary General addressed this Council on the topic of conflicts in Europe in 2017, he warned that, despite the achievements of the last 70 years, we should not take peace and prosperity in Europe for granted. He cautioned that as serious conflicts persisted in Europe, new threats and risks made it even more pressing for multilateral institutions and regional organizations to address dangerous challenges to the international order. The Secretary General's warnings then were informed in large part by the crises in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014, which demonstrated how real the risks of new outbreaks of conflict were. Today, a devastating war is being waged in a continent that should be equipped to prevent such catastrophes. We are concerned at the dismantling of long-standing confidence-building measures, arms control treaties, and other frameworks that were designed and agreed to sustain regional security. This includes the persistent use of regional mediation mechanisms as tools not to solve conflicts, but to manage them, which only helps ensure that those same conflicts continue. OSCE-led processes supported by the international community are now openly questioned by parties involved in them. Mr. President, it is more important than ever for all parties to recommit to the principles of the Helsinki Final Act, the Charter of Paris, and other landmark agreements that form the bedrock of European security architecture. In this context, we take good note of the efforts by the Polish chairperson in office under Minister Ray's leadership to initiate a renewed OSCE European security dialogue. How the OSCE and other regional actors choose to secure the future of European security cooperation will have an impact beyond Europe. The UN supports all efforts to restore mutual trust and respect among regional stakeholders, which is essential to preserving the continent from new conflict and the world from further instability. We therefore all have a stake in the outcome. Mr. President, for almost 50 years, the United Nations and the OSCE have partnered to promote European peace and stability. The challenges we face today and those potentially ahead demand that we work even more closely together. Thank you.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
President, let me start by warmly welcoming Chairperson in Office, Minister Rai, to the Security Council, and thank him for his briefing on behalf of the OSCE. I thank him also for his personal initiatives to reinvigorate the OSCE as a platform for dialogue on issues of European security. Thanks also to USG DiCarlo for her briefing. With an inclusive mandate and participation, the OSCE has a rich toolbox for increasing transparency, building trust, and reducing tensions. Using the organization's full potential to solve the crisis of today is essential, but the necessary political will is also required. President, we commend the OSCE for now turning the focus on its work in Ukraine towards mitigating the growing humanitarian crisis. Good use should be made of the OSCE's special monitoring mission to Ukraine, the SMM's national staff on the ground, the OSCE premises, its fleet of vehicles, and the SMM's long experience as an intermediary facilitating localized ceasefires. The OSCE can also provide valuable competence on border management and human trafficking. And we again reiterate our condemnation of Russia's illegal and unprovoked military aggression against Ukraine. That makes this expertise again necessary in Europe. The Russian aggression is a serious violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its forces from Ukrainian territory and cease all threats and military actions. Russia's warfare in urban and populated areas and the use of heavy explosive weapons is causing terrible long-term harm to civilians. Russia must fulfill its obligation to protect civilians, including children and children infrastructure. We are appalled by the lack of respect for international humanitarian law and the worsening humanitarian crisis across Ukraine, for which Russia alone bears the sole responsibility. Humanitarian actors in Ukraine must be allowed to stay and deliver. In addition, we are concerned about the steadily increasing strain on neighboring countries as people flee the fighting. Nevertheless, let me use this opportunity to commend Poland, the Polish people, and other OSCE neighbors on their response to the humanitarian crisis. The warm welcome and the protection you offer all refugees is a strong symbol of international solidarity. President, while the crisis in Ukraine requires most of our attention currently, Minister Rao has stated that a broad priority for their chairmanship is contributing to finding peaceful solutions also to regional and protracted conflicts. the OSCE continues to support reconciliation and conflict prevention efforts in other parts of the region, such as the South Caucasus, Moldova, and Western Balkans and Central Asia. The field missions, the autonomous institution, and the secretariat are important assets unique to the OSCE that we must continue to recognize and support. Both the UN and the OSCE share a vision. Our common duty is to work to strengthen security at the regional level, to end violent conflict, and ensure that human rights, democracy, rule of law, and gender equality can be enjoyed by all. In closing, especially in this current unstable European climate, let me underline Norway's strong support to the important role of the OSCE in promoting stability, peace, and democracy for more than 1 billion people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I warmly welcome to the Council His Excellency Mr. Zbigniew Rau, the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland and Chairman in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I thank Your Excellency for the briefing on the OSCE and note that Poland has assumed the leadership of this important organization at a time when the security situation and the political military environment in Europe is fast deteriorating. We therefore look forward to the OSCE's continued engagement and your leadership in helping to address the prevailing security challenges in Europe. I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing and welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in this meeting. Mr. President, Ghana takes note of the issues outlined by the OSCE Chairman in Office, in particular the commitment to pay special attention to finding peaceful solutions to the conflicts in the OSCE area, and encourages all efforts in resolving the protracted situations in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as the alarming situation in Ukraine following the Russian Federation's unjustified aggression against its neighbor. We also look forward to the additional efforts that will be made to respond effectively to the complex challenges of increased fragmentation, terrorism, anti-Semitism, transboundary crimes, and violations of human rights and freedoms that Europe is presently grappling with. Mr. President, against this backdrop, I would like to make the following additional points. First, Ghana welcomes the Polish commitment to uphold the concept of comprehensive and indivisible security based on the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, as well as other decisions of the OSCE, which also embody the very principles and purposes of the United Nations. Ensuring security on the European continent today requires of the participating states of the OSCE a renewed commitment to uphold and respect the long-established principles for interstate relations, the principles of sovereignty, political independence, territorial integrity, non-aggression, and the prohibition of the use or threat of the use of force remain the foundational principles upon which national and global aspirations for economic and social development can be built. Any attempts to redefine and renegotiate these bulwarks of stability will not only undermine the European security architecture, but also the rules-based international order and multilateralism. The OSCE must therefore undertake the difficult but necessary task of fostering political role and the recommitment of its member states to the implementation of their international obligations towards the peace, security, and stability of Europe, as well as its wider membership beyond Europe. Persistence in confidence and security-building measures among the participating states of the OSCE will therefore have to be sustained. Secondly, the OSCE's role as an important forum for dialogue on the security architecture of Europe needs to be re-emphasized. We believe that the OSCE provides a unique platform for open and good faith discussions among its 57 participating states if the schisms that have been opened up in the contemporary European security are to be addressed. We therefore welcome the ongoing efforts by the OSCE to facilitate dialogue between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, As party to the Trilateral Contact Group responsible for the implementation of the 2015 Minsk Agreement, the Oesc is indispensable in finding and implementing a comprehensive and peaceful settlement of the conflict, which regrettably has assumed a full-scale dimension. We note with regret in this context that the Special Monitoring Mission had to suspend its reporting activities following the evacuation of its international staff members to neighboring countries and remain concerned by cascading security, humanitarian, economic and developmental impacts of the situation in Ukraine. All efforts towards the pacific resolution of this conflict through dialogue and diplomacy must therefore be encouraged and engender the full support of this Council. Thirdly, we welcome the OSCE's efforts to enhance its cooperation with the United Nations. Ghana strongly supports the strengthening of relations between the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations in the maintenance of international peace and security. Chapter 8 of the Charter of the United Nations provides that the Security Council, in pursuit of its mandate, can leverage the comparative advantage of regional bodies to promote homegrown and regional approaches to the maintenance of international peace and security. We acknowledge, however, the complexities that such cooperation entails, and it's for this reason that Ghana is working within the Special Committee on the Charter of the Organization to identify gaps and propose guidelines to enhance complementarity between the United Nations and regional organizations. Finally, we note the enhanced engagement of the United Nations and OSCE aimed at finding lasting peace to the prevailing conflicts and growing threats to security in Europe and beyond. We welcome the focus on a human-centered approach and in that regard, take note of the reinforcing priorities within the economic environment dimensions as well as the human security dimensions. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Chair in Office Foreign Minister Rao, for your briefing and Under Secretary General DiCarlo for yours. I would like first to pay tribute to the bravery and dedication of OSCE staff, and in particular to Marina Fanina, a Ukrainian Special Monitoring Mission employee who was killed in the Russian shelling of Kharkiv on the 1st of March while getting medicine for her family. For decades, the OSCE has worked to bring security to Europe. And yet we meet today in the middle of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, one OSCE signatory tearing up the rulebook and pursuing war against another. As Foreign Minister Rao said, as if the Geneva Conventions and humanitarian law never existed. President Putin's war violates fundamental principles of both the OSCE and the United Nations: sovereignty, inviolability of borders, respect for territorial integrity, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. This war is a threat to us all, to the systems we have built together to preserve peace. It's a threat, too, to the peace and security of millions of people in Europe, Africa, and Asia who rely on agricultural, energy, and commodity supply chains already profoundly disrupted by Russia's invasion. We recognise the extensive efforts which Foreign Minister Rao described, which the OSCE has made to try and avoid this catastrophe. Russia was offered a chance to raise any security concerns in the OSCE renewed European security dialogue, but said it was not the right time. We now know they were planning war all along. Ukraine and others invoked the OSCE Vienna document risk reduction mechanism to seek transparency from Russia and Belarus and to de-escalate the situation. Russia refused to engage. And of course, the OSCE has worked for years to support implementation of the Minsk agreements. Russia is accused of the gravest war crimes, bombing schools, hospitals and homes, targeting families as they try to run to safety. We welcome action taken under the Moscow mechanism to hold Russia to account. The OSCE fact-finding mission must be given full access so that evidence can be gathered. Finally, Mr. President, I would like to stress that we continue to support the vital role of the OSCE field missions in Central Asia and the Western Balkans, including through its Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. We strongly support OSCE efforts to facilitate a peaceful resolution of the conflicts in Georgia, Moldova, and Nagorno-Karabakh. The United Kingdom remains steadfast in our support and appreciation for the work of the OSCE and for Poland's chairmanship at this critical time. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her briefing, for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I would like to wish a warm welcome today to Mr. Rau, and I commend Poland's work at the head of the OSCE during this time when European security is facing an extremely serious threat. France commends Chairperson Rau's commitment, unfailing commitment to the organisation and to defend the commitments and principles which has been the bedrock of it over the past 5 decades, today trampled upon by Russia. A month ago, this council met on the initiative of Russia to discuss the implementation of the Minsk agreements with the participation of representatives of the OSCE. During that meeting, the Russian deputy minister affirmed that Russia did not intend to attack Ukraine and called for the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Along with my German counterpart, we both gave an account of Paris and Berlin's efforts to make progress in implementing Resolution 2202. All the other members of the Council lent their support to this aim. In February, the Polish chairpersonship in office of the OSCE proposed setting up a renewed European security dialogue in order in particular to meet the security concerns expressed by Russia over recent months. We supported these efforts and the role of the OSCE as the main platform for dialogue for collective security in Europe. Mr. President, there's a harsh and very different reality today. It is very harsh. Russia has lied. It has flagrantly violated the UN Charter and the founding texts of the OSCE, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Paris Charter, which underpin stability in Europe. It has betrayed all of its commitments to implement the Minsk agreements signed by Russia and by the OSCE and endorsed by a resolution of this Council. The Russian act of aggression, supported by Belarus, is devastating for Ukraine and Ukrainians. However, the impact of it is even greater than this. The aggression also threatens multilateralism and international law and the institutions that are the custodians thereof, in particular the UN and the OSCE. Russia is thus directly harming the interests of all those states that are mobilizing in these organizations to find negotiation solutions to the crisis and challenges that they encounter. The situation is extremely serious. Therefore, France would thank once again the chairmanship, the Polish chairmanship of the OSCE for its quick response and in particular swiftly convening meetings. France would once again urge Russia to immediately cease hostilities in Ukraine, to withdraw its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine and to respect IHL and human rights. We enjoin it to once again respect the rule of law, which both within the UN and the OSCE, enable the peaceful settlement of differences. We reiterate our support for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and its staff, be these international staff who were to be forcibly evacuated, or locally recruited staff, some of whom are still being bombed. We remember Marina Finina, a local employee killed in Kharkiv, a victim of the Russian aggression. We reaffirm our support for the OSCE Human Dimension instruments, and in particular the Moscow mechanism tapped into on the 3rd of March, and the ODIHR, the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights fact-finding mechanism on the borders of Ukraine. So the OSCE needs to be able to continue to make its resources available to the settlement of conflict in European area in cooperation with the UN. And despite the war in Ukraine, France, as a co-chair of the OSCE Minsk Group and president of the European Union Council, remains fully mobilized to contribute to the dialogue between Armenia and Azerbaijan and to peace and stability in the South Caucasus. The meetings that took place in February and in December meant that guidelines in this area could be established. We call nonetheless for efforts to be made on pending humanitarian matters, in particular the release of war prisoners of war and other detained persons, as well as the area of protection of heritage and mine clearance. We are concerned about the increase in armed incidents, and we urge all parties to bring an end to the repetition of such incidents. We reiterate our unfailing support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia and Moldova and the role of the OSCE to make progress in the settlement of conflicts that are taking place there. France also welcomes the concerted work of the Polish chairmanship and ODIHR in maintaining, despite the circumstances, crucial dialogue with civil society. Mr. President, we're determined not to let Russia take multilateral collective security organizations down with it. France reaffirms its support to the United Nations, to the OSCE, and to the cooperation that the two organizations are developing to contribute to the settlement of crises in Europe. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me thank the OSCE Chairman in Office, Minister Rao, and USG DiCarlo for the information provided. We welcome this timely exchange with OSCE, one of the world's largest regional security organizations, which brings together 57 participating states across 3 continents bound by joint commitments. As an important pillar of the international rules-based order, OSCE plays an essential role in addressing many of the challenges on the Council's agenda. Therefore, the collaboration and partnership between the two organizations is key and needs to be strengthened. Albania fully supports the priorities of Polish OSCE chairmanship. We welcome the focus on safeguarding a comprehensive security order by defending the principles of the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter, and the Charter for European Security. These principles are neither negotiable nor subject to revision or reinterpretation. The commitment to human rights, values of freedom and democracy, as well as the support of its institutions, should continue to be an irreplaceable blueprint in the work of the OSCE. We also welcome the work of the OSCE and the United Nations in the framework of Women, Peace and Security Agenda and reconciliation processes in the Western Balkans. There has hardly been a more suitable and urgent time to reaffirm these fundamental principles, which for nearly 5 decades have stood as effective mechanisms to conflict prevention and de-escalation in Europe, until the 24th of February. Dear colleagues, in 2020, soon after Albania assumed the OSCE chairmanship in office, we were confronted with an invisible enemy which threatened the entire world. It went by the name COVID-19 pandemic. We still do not know everything about it, but we do know far too well what it did to humanity, to our way of life, to our countries and economies, and in many ways, to all of us. 2 years later, as Poland started its chairmanship, the Oesc area was confronted with another threat. But this time, everyone knew where it was coming from. We were warned about what was going to happen. And now, 3 weeks into this war, we are left with the uninterrupted onslaught of breaking news on the devastation that Russia is unleashing with rage upon Ukraine and its people. Dear colleagues, for months, huge efforts were made by the international community, including by the Polish chairmanship and yourself, Minister, in seeking a peaceful solution. Every stone was turned, every possibility was used. The reality shows clearly now that these efforts were doomed to fail because the invasion was premeditated. It was a plan to be executed despite everything. It was a war Kremlin wanted. We express our gratitude to Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, the Czech Republic, and probably I'm forgetting, for these incredible efforts that they are making in sheltering thousands of civilians forced to flee the massive bombardments and war atrocities. Dear colleagues, OSCE is a key player for peace and security. It is an important platform to discuss issues related to comprehensive security, equipped with mechanisms as well as confidence and security building measures. It remains as relevant as when it was created. It is clear that the overarching difference between Russia and the existing European security order, based on international law and OSCE principles, is a structural one. While we are served here with all kinds of fantasies that melt like snow under the sun, the real concerns are democratic values and principles of freedom on which the system is based. In this respect, the OSCE comprehensive concept of security connects the dots between domestic repression and external aggression. Democracy, human rights, and rule of law are key aspects for security within and between states. Mr. President, we failed to prevent a pure, unprovoked, and unjustified act of aggression committed by a serial violator of the rules and norms of the international order. We should not fail to make the aggressor pay for it and the crimes committed. Albania supports the initiative to invoke the OSCE Moscow mechanism in order to establish facts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including due to deliberate and indiscriminate acts against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Its findings, together with those of the Commission of Inquiry established by Human Rights Council, should be presented to relevant accountability mechanisms, as well as national, regional, and international courts or tribunals. The massive sanctions imposed on Russia have ripple effects for the whole world, including for our own countries and citizens. But it is the price to pay so that Russia's actions do not go unchecked and unpunished. We hope that the effects of these unprecedented sanctions will wake up the Russian citizens to see the reality through the terrible deeds of their army, not through the distorted mirror of propaganda. To understand why the whole world calls Russia an aggressor. To feel for their neighbor that is being savagely destroyed, cities that are becoming graveyards, children that are forcefully leaving their childhood behind because of such insanity. The sooner this happens, the sooner this war and any spillover threats will stop. Let me end, Mr. President, by recalling the 754th meeting of the Security Council on 4 November 1956. History has recorded it as the day when a popular revolt in Hungary was viciously crushed by Soviet tanks, uninvited, of course. I will quote Mr. Sobolev, the representative of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics at that meeting, justifying the action, and I quote, "The Nagy government openly adopted a reactionary and fascist policy aimed at the complete liquidation of the People's Democratic regime in Hungary, at the restoration of the old landowner capitalist system and the establishment of a fascist dictatorship," end of quote. It was about the so-called fascists 65 years ago. It is about the so-called Nazis and denazification now. The same discourse, the same action with their terrible consequences. Ukraine is a critical test for European security, including OSCE. We must refuse a world according to Russia. We must determine the preservation and the enforcement of the rules-based international order. One man has started this war. One man can stop it. Anytime. Thank you.
أشكر ممثل ألبانيا على بيانه وأعطي الكلمة لممثل البرازيل.
I thank the distinguished representative of Albania and now give the floor to Brazil.
Mr. President, at the outset, let me thank Minister Howe for his thoughtful remarks. I also thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. OSCE plays a crucial role in the maintenance of peace and security in Europe. It is one of the key partners of the United Nations in dealing with the many challenges on the Security Council's agenda. However, we need to recognize that at this crucial juncture, the architecture of peace and security, not only in Europe, but worldwide, is facing an unprecedented challenge. The conflict in Ukraine, with its toll of human suffering, forced displacement, humanitarian emergency, and systemic risk, is an extraordinary challenge for United Nations and the OSCE in their joint mission to guarantee peace and security in Europe. The cessation of hostilities must be our most pressing objective. All parties must fully respect international humanitarian law and adopt measures to protect civilians. We call for continued efforts to agree on well-planned humanitarian mechanisms that ensure the safe passage of civilians. Furthermore, we should strive for the immediate, full, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian personnel for a timely delivery of assistance to those in need. Moreover, the war in Ukraine has momentous implications for the international order, especially the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. In this regard, Brazil calls on all parties to strictly observe the international law, the prohibition of the use of force, the peaceful resolution of disputes, and the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, no intervention, and the protection of human rights shall remain the pillars of our collective security system. We note that the present conflict will also have a significant impact on commodities and energy prices. Such effects could be further worsened by the application of unilateral sanctions. Developing countries stand to bear a disproportionate burden of such negative shocks. There is no alternative to diplomatic talks. The security concerns of all parties must be addressed by meaningful negotiations. We renew our plea for them to engage in dialogue with openness, flexibility, and a sense of urgency to find ways for a lasting peace in Ukraine and in the wider region. The OSCE has a key role to play in supporting international efforts to bring an end to the current hostilities. Moreover, the expertise of the OSCE may be valuable in monitoring a ceasefire that, we hope, will encompass a comprehensive disengagement of troops and military equipment on the ground. Besides the conflict in Ukraine, we also would like to mention the ongoing crisis in Georgia, as well as the dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the region of Nagorno-Karabakh. Regarding the situation in Georgia, we commend the OSCE for its full support to the Geneva International discussions and related incident prevention and response mechanism formats. This dialogue process, co-chaired by the OSCE, UN, and EU, is an important example of UN OSCE cooperation in conflict resolution. The unresolved conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh remains a challenge to international peace and security in Europe. After the armed conflict of 2020, we are still witnessing renewed outbreaks of clashes between Azeris and Armenians, some of them resulting in casualties, including among civilians. Last week, incidents damaged the main pipeline that brings gas to Nagorno-Karabakh. Such incidents further undermine the needed trust between Armenia and Azerbaijan to renew efforts towards a lasting peace agreement. We support the efforts undertaken by OSCE in order to give impetus to this process. We would also like to express our recognition to OSCE work to advance the women, peace and security agenda. Important issues such as the impunity for sexual and gender-based violence must be tackled. In that regard, we note the openness of the OSCE to involve civil society organizations in conflict resolutions and peace building, as well as to engage women in all stages of peace processes. The maintenance of peace and security in Europe is under unprecedented challenge. Close cooperation between the UN and the OSCE is more needed than ever. I thank you.
أشكر ممثل البرازيل على بيانه.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil, and I now give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Undersecretary General DiCarlo, thank you for your briefing today. Foreign Minister Rao, thank you as well for your briefing to the Council. Your engagement with the Council comes at a critical juncture, as many of my colleagues have said, a critical juncture for European and international security following Russia's aggression against Ukraine. You've demonstrated extraordinary leadership at the OSCE during this crisis, and the United States thanks you. The United States was a strong supporter of your attempt to avert this crisis through the launch of a reinvigorated European security dialogue at the OSCE. And we support your efforts to increase the OSCE's ability to respond to the humanitarian crisis through the OSCE's toolbox. We look forward to working with you on these important issues in your capacity as chairman in office. I'd like to begin by expressing our outrage over the death of journalist Brent Renaud, who was killed by Russian forces while covering refugees leaving a checkpoint at Irpin yesterday. According to his colleagues, Mr. Renaud was in the area because he understood the critical role independent media has played in providing objective coverage of Russia's war of choice against Ukraine. His death shows that Russia will go to any extent to silence narratives that challenge its propaganda. And it underscores the importance of upholding the safety of journalists as they undertake their important work. Excuse me. Last year at this meeting on cooperation, last year, at this meeting on cooperation between the UN and the OSCE, the United States recalled that we had just passed the 7th anniversary of Russia's invasion and occupation of Crimea and the launch of its aggression in eastern Ukraine. We noted that in those 7 years, the Russian-fueled conflict in eastern Ukraine had killed more than 13,000 people and wounded tens of thousands more. And we warned that Russia's aggression was far from over. It had been less than 3 weeks since Russia launched a major invasion against the rest of Ukraine. During these 3 weeks, Russia unleashed horrific devastation against another UN member state, resulting in the death of thousands and the displacement of over 2.5 million people. Russia must immediately cease all hostilities, withdraw its forces from Ukraine, and take the path of diplomacy, in keeping with the principles of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. Mr. President, Russia's further invasion of Ukraine is an unprecedented challenge, a challenge to the post-World War II European security order and to cooperation between all of us. Cooperation between the UN and OSCE now remains as essential as ever. Unfortunately, two OSCE participating states, the Russian Federation and Belarus, continue to violate the foundational principles of the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act. Russia, with Belarus's support, has shown utter contempt for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states, as well as for the human rights and fundamental freedoms of its own people. We have seen Russia try to spread disinformation and distract this council from its aggression. But no amount of Russian disinformation can distract from this fact. The Kremlin is waging a brutal, premeditated, unprovoked war of choice against Ukraine. This is a war carried out with the support and the facilitation of the Lukashenko regime. Russia does not want its people to learn the appalling truth about the senseless death and destruction it is causing in Ukraine. This is why the Kremlin has forced domestic and foreign independent media outlets to suspend their operations in Russia or to close permanently. This is why it has blocked access to independent news sites and social networks. The United States reaffirms its strong and unwavering commitment to the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission, which has been forced to temporarily suspend its work in Ukraine. Despite Russia's efforts to impede its operations, the Special Monitoring Mission's impartial reporting has proved invaluable to the international community's understanding of the security situation on the ground. We join others in expressing our heartfelt condolences for the loss of staff member Marina Finina, who on March 1st was killed by Russia's shelling in Kharkiv while trying to get supplies for her family. The United States was proud to join 44 other countries in launching the OSCE Moscow mechanism to establish an expert mission. The mission will document human rights violations and abuses, breaches of international humanitarian law, and possible war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia's forces in Ukraine's territory. The mission will meticulously compile the facts and create a written report that can be presented to relevant accountability mechanisms. We also welcome the UN Human Rights Council's immediate launch of a commission of inquiry to pursue similar aims. The Commission of Inquiry and the OSCE expert mission will complement one another in bringing the truth to light. Under the OSCE Vienna document, all participating states committed to respond in good faith to the concerns that other states raise regarding unusual military activities as part of our collective efforts to reduce the risk of miscalculation, lower tensions, and build confidence. Russia's blatant and unfounded dismissal of Ukraine's legitimate invocation of the Vienna document, risk reduction mechanism for unusual military activities, illustrated once again Russia's disregard of its international commitments. Belarus's refusal to substantively respond to the Baltic states invoking the Vienna document risk reduction mechanism showed the Lukashenko regime's disregard as well. Mr. President, in addition to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, as others have mentioned, we must also not forget the other important priorities of the OSCE. We must not forget that Russia continues to occupy parts of Georgia. It also maintains its forces in Moldova without host government consent. We welcome the continued commitment of the OSCE to seek a peaceful resolution of the conflict in Georgia, including by co-chairing the Geneva International Discussion. We regret that Russia has not fulfilled its obligation and its commitments under the 2008 ceasefire agreement, including withdrawal of troops to pre-conflict positions. The United States urges all Geneva International Discussion participants to ensure residents of conflict-affected areas are able to visit their relatives engage in peaceful economic activities, and to move freely without fear of detention or arbitrary punishment, and with access to documentation that will allow them to return to their homes. The United States remains committed to promoting a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous future for the South Caucasus region. As a Minsk Group co-chair, we join others in urging Armenia and Azerbaijan to continue and intensify their diplomatic engagement to find comprehensive solutions to all outstanding issues related to or resulting from the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. In conclusion, Mr. President, the United States appreciates the long-standing partnership between the UN and the OSCE. UN presentations at OSCE Permanent Council meetings and UN participation in annual OSCE events, as well as the close coordination between OSCE field operations and UN agencies on the ground, have only strengthened this partnership. In the face of Russian aggression, the UN and OSCE must continue working together to advance peace, security, development, and human rights, which will contribute to international peace and stability. Thank you very much.
أشكر ممثل الولايات
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and I give the floor to Mexico. Thank you very much, President. We express gratitude for the information provided by the Polish Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Zbigniew Rau, as Chairperson in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. We also express gratitude for the information provided by Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo. Mexico shares the priority identified by Poland's chairmanship in office regarding maintaining a people-centered security focus. In any armed conflict, and the one in Ukraine today is no exception, civilians are often the most affected. We therefore support all efforts to prioritize support to the most vulnerable. The prevailing situation in Ukraine, as we have heard, is critical. It is therefore disquieting to us that more than 2 weeks into the conflict, the Security Council has been unable to issue any statement about this attack upon international peace and security. But expressing our concern about this silence is not enough to correct that. For this, we were compelled to turn to the Uniting for Peace mechanism in the General Assembly so that it could assume the role that the Council was unable to fulfill. However, we here reiterate our call, alongside that of many others, to bring an end to the hostilities and to resume, as soon as possible, political dialogue and the diplomatic track. Until this happens, it is our ethical and moral imperative to protect the civilian population insofar as is possible, and to guarantee that they receive the humanitarian aid which they so sorely need. This alone was our intention as we, alongside France, presented a draft resolution of an eminently humanitarian nature. We have every intention of insisting upon this and hope to count upon your support and that of the international community. President, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has played a fundamental role in drawing up impartial reports on the prevailing situation on the ground, as well as creating a platform for the exchange of information. Regrettably, the Russian invasion has weakened its operating capacity. Some of its activities and reports have been suspended, just at the precise moment when objective and true information are the most needed. In this regard, we recognize the fact that given the serious deterioration of the humanitarian situation, the Special Standing Committee of the OSCE has requested the Special Monitoring Mission to temporarily redeploy its work to support the urgent work of humanitarian assistance. It is fundamental that this special mission have full, safe access on the ground to be able to fulfill its mandate and carry out the delicate tasks assigned to it. We hope that in a not too distant future, the OSCE will also resume its functions in the context of the Trilateral Contact Group, because it is there, through political dialogue, that the options allowing us to overcome this crisis are to be found. President, since its foundation, the OSCE has played a fundamental role in fostering trust, working on conflict prevention, and managing crises through diplomacy. The OSCE's work has been and continues to be critical in situations which are on the agenda of international peace and security, such as Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Kosovo region, or the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. We therefore attach the greatest value to its mediation work and its good offices through the deployment of its peace missions, its work on the ground, and the tasks that its special representatives carry out. We therefore wish to underscore the fact that regional and sub-regional organisations, as is the case of the OSCE, are called upon to assume a decisive role in implementing Resolution 2616 of this Council. I conclude, President, urging this Security Council to step up cooperation with the OSCE upon the basis of a more preventive and more effective diplomacy, which includes the mediation work which can foster peaceful dispute settlement. Thank you very much, President. I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico for that statement, and I give the floor to Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank His Excellency, Mr. Zbigniew Rau, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland and Chairperson in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, for his briefing. I congratulate you, sir, on your assumption to this office and wish you every success as you advance the goals of the OSCE. I also thank USG, Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, for her briefing. Mr. President, this briefing is happening when the foundations of Europe's security order are being shaken to the core by an ongoing devastating armed conflict that reminds us of the age-old European wars. The armed conflict in Ukraine is already extremely costly in all aspects, ranging from loss of life to millions of refugees and internally displaced, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and destabilization of economies across the globe. If not urgently halted, the consequences will be more catastrophic, not only to Ukraine and Europe at large, but also to the entire world, particularly small and fragile economies in the global south. With this and other protracted conflicts and related dynamics, it has become imperative, in our view, to redesign a security architecture for Europe that is more firmly grounded on such fundamental principles as respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of member states, sovereign equality between states, respect of agreements, and the pacific settlement of disputes. We agree with the OSCE chairperson in office that the organization offers a good forum for the region to discuss every aspect related to peace and security. We are confident that it can serve a pivotal role in an inclusive discourse on a new security order for Europe. We commend the OSCE for its preventive diplomacy efforts and its commitment to multilateralism. In this regard, Kenya lauds the close cooperation it has with the United Nations and urges its strengthening in line with Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. Allow me, Mr. President, to briefly comment on some of the current issues of concern in the OSCE region. On the deeply concerning situation in Ukraine, Kenya commends the OSCE for its efforts to execute its mandate in monitoring the implementation of the 2015 Minsk agreements endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2202 of 2015. We continue to call for an immediate pause on humanitarian grounds and to give a chance to diplomacy in the search for a sustainable political solution. On Kosovo, Kenya believes that it is the responsibility of all relevant parties, including the OSCE, as one of Kosovo's largest field operations, to ensure a sustainable environment conducive to Kosovo's long-term peace and stability. On Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kenya continues to urge the authorities to work together to not only ensure full compliance with the General Framework Agreement for Peace, but also to make progress on the 5 objectives and 2 conditions. With regard to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, we continue to support the efforts of the OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs in finding a comprehensive and sustainable settlement. In conclusion, Kenya reiterates that genuine dialogue should be the primary option in resolving conflicts. We encourage the OSCE to continue engaging with the Security Council, other regional bodies, international partners, and other actors in the pursuit of the region's peace, security, and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Thank you, President. I thank Minister Zbigniew Rau, Chairperson in Office for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, for the information he has shared with us this morning. I also thank Under-Secretary General Madame DiCarlo for her briefing. We have noted the reading of Chairperson Rau's situation and the forecasts of the organisation regarding the issues and challenges that it must meet in order to fulfil its role. President, with its 57 member states and partners from Europe, Asia, America and Africa, the OSCE has cooperation in its DNA, according to the spirit of the Helsinki Final Act. This cooperation is an ideal springboard for achieving peace and security, and for offering its members a space for safe coexistence, which is free of armed conflict. Cooperation naturally means acting together, being permanently in concert during peacetime and during wartime. It means smoothing differences, reducing tension and seeking dispute settlement which fosters peaceful outcomes. Throughout its almost 50 years, the OSCE has had to face numerous crises which, whilst not shaking its foundations, have led it to question its guiding principles. One of the pressing questions is to know how to translate the principles agreed upon in Helsinki into the current security context. Tackling this substantive issue requires the fulfilment of the OSCE's role as a bridge between its members, which must be based upon a significant reserve of trust between these members, so as to interact in good faith with a view to mutual benefits. In any case, the conflict prevention potential of the OSCE is in some doubt, as we witness with concern the rise of nationalisms in Europe, secessionist tension in the southeast of Europe, multiple crises in Central Asia, or numerous security threats resulting from an increase in terrorism. The numerous outbreaks of tension resulting from the splitting apart of former blocs threaten to erode numerous regions of the world, and in particular continental Europe. This is an issue of significant concern, and not only the OSCE but the international community as a whole must decisively anticipate its consequences. The latest events, marked by the war in Ukraine, or the situation in the Karabakh region mean that the OSCE must question its ability to play its role as a bridge between East and West in its territorial competence, and its capacity to set in motion its conflict prevention mechanisms to prevent and resolve all armed conflicts in its sphere of influence. Focusing on the OSCE's mandate in the context of the war in Ukraine means questioning its role on the resolution of the crisis. Given the clear unravelling of the Minsk agreements, how to get out of this current quagmire? What are the credible levers which can be used at the moment to ensure that diplomacy prevails in the situation in Ukraine? Responding rationally to these questions compel us to acknowledge the urgency and act in line with the security and humanitarian needs. President, my country has no experience of war and has never taken part in an armed conflict. It is perhaps for this reason that my country has always preferred dialogue over breaches and privileged political solutions and diplomatic solutions over the use of force. It is this ideal which underpinned our enthusiasm to sit at this place at the Council table, to contribute to finding solutions to the crises gripping the world. We must find a solution to the crisis in Ukraine, because its consequences will have a negative impact on the whole of the world and on the values of the United Nations. We hereby reiterate our solemn call upon each member of this Council and beyond this Council, upon each member of the international community, to renew our ownership of and realign ourselves with our common commitment to ensure international peace and security for the peoples of the world. This is what we committed to in signing the Charter of the United Nations. To conclude, we encourage cooperation between the OSCE and the United Nations and express our support to the President of the OSCE in his efforts to find a solution to the crisis in Ukraine. We also express our appreciation for the remarkable role played, notably by Poland, in welcoming those fleeing the war in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I welcome Foreign Minister Rao of Poland, Chairperson in Office of OSCE, at this meeting. I have listened carefully to the briefings by Mr. Rao and USG DiCarlo. China has always supported the efforts by the UN and the Security Council on the basis of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter to develop partnership with regional organizations, including OSCE, with a view to effectively addressing challenges in international peace and security. OSCE covers a large area and is fairly rich in its coordination mechanisms. For years, it has done a lot of work in enhancing the mutual trust among member states, preventing and resolving conflicts, and addressing non-traditional security threats. We welcome and are pleased to see the role of OSCE in complementing the international system with the UN at its core. Mr. President, the international situation is undergoing deep challenges and is full of instability and uncertainty. The outbreak of the crisis in Ukraine has further led us to think how to maintain peace and stability in international architecture and focus more on the genuine avenue towards universal security and common development. We must seek new enlightenments and answers from the history of and the current severe challenges facing OSCE. First, we must adhere to the general direction of dialogue and cooperation. Even in the most intensive moment of the Cold War, dialogue and cooperation were possible and necessary. The more frictions, differences, and potential risks there are, the more important and necessary it is to enhance understanding and mutual trust. The world is now in a new era. The path of dialogue and cooperation should become wider and wider rather than narrower and narrower. Differences among states in national interests, social system, and ideology shall not become an obstacle to dialogue, let alone a reason for confrontation. Second, the world is indivisible, security is indivisible. In the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, the important principle of indivisible security was first established. This principle carries special significance under the current circumstances. Therefore, it should not only be upheld, but all the more should be implemented. The final solution to the crisis in Ukraine is to take seriously and respect the reasonable security concerns of all states and form a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. Third, the Cold War was over long ago. Cold War mentality based on bloc confrontation should be completely rejected. Sticking to hegemony mentality and provoking bloc confrontation will only bring the world disasters and exacerbate turmoil and division. That is the case in Europe. It is also the case in other regions. This world does not need a new Cold War. This world can live with common growth and progress. All countries must, under the banner of multilateralism, strengthen unity and cooperation and work together for a community of shared future for mankind. Mr. President, China's position on the question of Ukraine is consistent and clear-cut. Recently, President Xi Jinping held a video conference with leaders of France and Germany, where he pointed out that sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states shall be respected, that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter shall be observed, that the reasonable security concerns of all states shall be taken seriously, and that all efforts towards peaceful settlement of crises shall be supported. The 4 shells, the 4 points, represent the most authoritative position of China on the question of Ukraine. Based on this position, China will strengthen communication and coordination with all the parties concerned and play a constructive role in promoting peace through negotiations. China is deeply concerned about and regrets the developments in Ukraine. Early cessation of hostilities is a common aspiration of the international community. Dialogue and negotiation are the only feasible and realistic method. Recently, Russia and Ukraine have held multiple rounds of negotiations and have demonstrated aspiration and willingness to further continue negotiations. The international community must help sustain the positive momentum, actively encourage and support Russian-Ukraine negotiations and create the necessary conditions and environment to that end. The crisis in Ukraine is interwoven with European security and stability. We encourage OSCE to bring into full play its advantages and set up the necessary platform for the negotiation and communication of the parties concerned. We call for maximum restraint. We call for effective guarantee for civilian security and their basic needs, and we call for safe and unimpeded humanitarian corridor so as to prevent the appearance of a humanitarian crisis of a larger scale. China's 6-point initiative on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine has won more and more support from other countries. We have also provided humanitarian assistance to Ukraine in kind. We support the United Nations in fully playing its coordinating role in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, and we are ready to work with other parties in achieving consensus on the Council's response to the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. We must also note that 3-foot-deep ice doesn't come from one day's cold. The current status in the situation in Ukraine is an outcome of the interaction of complex historical and present factors. To solve a complex issue, calm and rational thinking are all the more needed. Wanton use of sanctions will not only not help solve the issue, but will create new problems. Escalating sanctions has already affected and will continue to affect global finance, energy, food, transportation, supply chain, and other areas, devastating the already fragile world economy caused by the pandemic, thus seriously and adversely affecting people's livelihood, developing countries in particular. We once again call for greater diplomatic efforts by the international community to de-escalate tensions and bring the Ukrainian issue back to the political track. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I'd like to thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo also for her briefing this morning. And Minister Rao, I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome to the Council, and many thanks for your informative briefing earlier. At the outset, I'd certainly like to express Ireland's admiration and appreciation to the government and people of Poland for your generosity and solidarity to those fleeing the war in Ukraine. We in Ireland are also fully committed to supporting the humanitarian response. Mr. President, the Helsinki Final Act, signed in 1975, laid the foundation for what is now the OSCE. As an inclusive forum where East and West could meet, the OSCE, with its unique concept of comprehensive security, has served the European continent well for almost 50 years. As a founding member of the OSCE, Ireland regards the organisation as a vital instrument for European stability and security. We greatly value the OSCE's work on conflict prevention and resolution, its activities on human rights, and its regional role under the UN Charter. As we now experience another tragic episode in Europe's long and often violent history, the work of the OSCE takes on a renewed significance. The Russian Federation's relentless, unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine casts a dark shadow across our continent as innocent civilians in Ukraine suffer unbearably, and we watch a humanitarian catastrophe unfold. Ireland once again strongly condemns the Russian Federation's invasion of Ukraine, a sovereign and an independent country, and calls on it to uphold its international obligations. The Russian Federation must immediately cease hostilities, unconditionally withdraw its troops from the entire territory of Ukraine, and refrain from using further threats or the use of force of any kind against Ukraine or any other OSCE participating state. We urge it to turn away from war and choose the path of dialogue and diplomacy, not bullets and bombs. Mr. President, Ireland welcomes the priorities for 2022 outlined by the Chairperson in Office of the OSCE. I want to assure Minister Rao of Ireland's full support in his important role. As Undersecretary General DiCarlo said earlier, the OSCE is a unique organisation extending from Vancouver to Vladivostok. It is the embodiment of a vision for Europe's security architecture, a vision of creating a different relationship for resolving issues between states. Its strength lies in its value as an essential forum for free and open engagement. This is why we welcome in particular the renewed European security dialogue initiated by the Chairperson in Office, aimed at using the full potential of the OSCE as a platform for dialogue. Since 2014, the Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has made a significant difference to the lives of people living along the contact line in eastern Ukraine, away from public limelight. The mission negotiated local ceasefires, enabling repair works on critical civilian infrastructure, giving millions in eastern Ukraine access to fundamental services. It was an indispensable, impartial voice and the eyes and ears of participating states on the ground. Allow me to express our sincere condolences on the death of Marina Fanina, the SMM national member killed by shelling. We commend the OSCE for its evacuation of staff, and we recognise the evacuation as a temporary measure and acknowledge that the mission is working differently right now and is ready to resume its monitoring work. We stress the importance of an OSCE presence on the ground into the future. Mr. President, while the eyes of the world are rightly focused on Ukraine, we are mindful that the institutions and field offices of the OSCE continue to operate throughout the region. Indeed, it's vital that they do so. Ireland continues to support renewed efforts towards a negotiated, comprehensive and sustainable settlement of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, particularly on the long-term status of Nagorno-Karabakh. We believe the OSCE Minsk Group is the appropriate format through which to achieve this objective. It is essential that both sides meaningfully engage in this effort. Ireland, together with our EU partners, stands ready to contribute to the intensification of negotiations in this format. Ireland strongly supports the Polish Chair's intention to keep conflict prevention and resolution at the top of the OSCE's agenda, including in Georgia and Moldova. Here, too, will the OSCE's work to advance the women, peace and security agenda be critical, particularly for those women who have been forced to flee Ukraine. We also welcome Poland's emphasis on responding to new and emerging threats to regional peace and security, such as violent extremism and attacks in cyberspace, as well as the challenges we may face in a post-COVID environment through effective multilateralism. Ireland recalls that the OSCE plays a unique role in holding all states, all participating states, accountable to OSCE principles and commitments. The inclusion of civil society is essential in this regard. We fully support the OSCE's work on democracy and human rights and reaffirm our steadfast support for the invaluable role played by the OSCE autonomous institutions, in particular the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, whose work on election monitoring we support without reservation. In conclusion, Mr. President, the OSCE's comprehensive approach to security is as pertinent and relevant as ever. Respect for human rights, the rule of law and economic and environmental progress are all essential elements for sustaining peace and prosperity. We look forward to working closely with the Chairperson in office to ensure strong, complementary partnership between the UN and the OSCE. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me begin by welcoming His Excellency Professor Rao, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland. I also thank him for his briefing on the activities of the OSCE and its priorities in his capacity as the OSCE Chairperson in office. I also thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. The role of regional and sub-regional organizations in maintenance of international peace and security, as well as their cooperation with the United Nations, is provided in Chapter 8 of the UN Charter. We support active engagement between the UN and OSCE based on the Framework for Cooperation and Coordination signed in 1993. Regional organizations have a critical role to play in addressing challenges to security environment by promoting dialogue between the parties and dissuading external influence. We are of the view that bilateral and regional agreements negotiated between the parties provide a good basis for lasting and peaceful resolution of disputes. The OSCE has attributes that make it the forum of choice in many situations. Of first and foremost importance, the OSCE is an inclusive Euro-Atlantic forum for consultation and joint action. OSCE is a structured dialogue mechanism anchored in the guiding principles of transparency, collective ownership, inclusiveness, and respect for diverging views, is aimed at rebuilding trust in multilateralism amid renewed geopolitical rivalry in the OSCE area. The challenges confronting the OSCE community come from different sources. They include not only challenges to sovereignty, but threats to peace from ethnic tensions and violent separatism within states. The OSCE, as the world's largest security organization, is also addressing some of the toughest transnational threats, such as proliferation of weapons, terrorism, cybersecurity, migration, environmental damage, and drug trafficking. While noting the ongoing global counterterrorism efforts and contribution of OSCE, we would like to take this opportunity to reiterate the importance of this issue. OSCE was among the first regional organizations to strongly condemn the terrorist attack on Indian Parliament in 2001. OSCE needs to take into account such cross-border terrorist attacks and other new and emerging threats. In this context, the 8-point action plan on counterterrorism proposed by India's External Affairs Minister on 11th January 2021 while addressing the Council also merits serious consideration of the OSCE. OSCE has been playing an important role in facilitating implementation of package of measures across both sides of contact line in eastern Ukraine. However, recent developments in Ukraine and consequent deterioration of security situation have altered the functioning of the special monitoring mission. India has been consistent in calling for an immediate end to all hostilities in Ukraine. Our Prime Minister has repeatedly called for an urgent ceasefire and that there is no other path left but of dialogue and diplomacy. The human toll continues to mount and the humanitarian situation has become dire. India undertook intensive and immediate steps to evacuate its nationals. Till date, about 22,500 Indians have returned home safely. We are grateful to all our partners for their support in our evacuation efforts. We call for direct contacts and negotiations with a view to cease hostilities. India has been in touch with both the Russian Federation and Ukraine in this regard and will continue to remain engaged. We continue to underline the need to respect the UN Charter, international law, and the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. We also support OSCE Minsk Group's continued efforts for a peaceful resolution of the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. India believes that any lasting resolution of the conflict can only be achieved peacefully through diplomatic negotiations, and we call on parties to implement the agreement reached. We note with concern that steps that have been committed have yet to materialize. To conclude, Mr. President, we recognize the significant contribution of OSCE to the promotion of a rules-based international order and strengthening multilateralism. We join all other members of the Council to extend our good wishes to Poland's chairmanship of OSCE. I also take this opportunity to sincerely thank Foreign Minister of Poland for the generosity and help extended to our citizens in their safe return from conflict zones in Ukraine. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We were under no surprise by listening to the statement of the Chairperson in Office of the OSCE. We knew what he would talk about even before he took the floor. We are surprised, and this is not the first time, and this was the case on Friday in this very chamber, that the USG's statement of the UN, that in her assessment went way beyond the remit of impartiality. We're surprised by her statement, which is stipulated under her obligations as an international civil servant. Her views and her pushing forward of fakes about the unselective bombing of civilian facilities and the use of cluster bombs by Russian armed forces with the references to reliable sources of information raises doubts as to who's sitting around this table, a senior official of the UN Secretariat or a representative of one of the member states. The UN over recent days has repeatedly drawn attention to the topic of mediation in conflicts. What type of mediation can we talk about when you obviously have picked a side in this conflict? And the Undersecretary General didn't manage to find any words to report about the strike by the strike bomb by the Ukrainian armed forces that was filled with cluster bombs and that struck the heart of Donetsk, as a result of which 20 people died and 35 civilians were injured. And also, the representatives of Western countries didn't manage to mention this either, who for 8 years have just turned a blind eye to what's happening in Donbass and in the conditions in which people are living under constant shelling. Unfortunately, the OSCE is party to this too, that has just ignored the actions of the Ukrainian armed forces and the nationalists in Donbass. I would like to ask my American colleague, 13,000 people have died. He mentioned that figure. They died in Donbass. There's Russia as well. Do you not know who are most of these unfortunate people? Most of these are people who died in DPR and LPR. My American colleague mentioned the death of Brent Reno in Irpin, apparently from a Russian shot. We regret any people who die in a conflict, but I'd just like to make two clarifying points. Firstly, he wasn't a journalist. That was something that the New York Times itself stated. And on the internet, there's information circulating that the other part of his actions was not actually journalist activity, it was filmmaking, and that's on open access, that information. Secondly, Irpin is fully controlled by the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian units. So given what the colleagues are saying who survived that, it was them who opened fire on their vehicles. Mr. President, we were under no illusion. We knew that today's meeting would in no way be on cooperation between the UN and the OSCE. The demand for cooperation over recent years has sharply decreased due to attempts by a certain club of states to replace the UN Charter by a rules-based order. The OSCE has become a glaring example of this. This has become particularly noticeable recently when the work of the organization, which even before this paid disproportionate attention to countries to the east of Vienna, de facto boiled down to just one subject. The discussions on this, as far as we can gather, are not so much unprofessional, but in fact hysterical in tone, and unacceptable tone has been used. When Mr. Rao on the 15th of February visited Moscow, we had substantive talks with him. Back then, he talked about the importance of a proactive, positive approach and the quest for solutions and the rejection of mutual accusations. We supported such an approach. We expressed our conviction that the chairmanship should facilitate the formation of a unifying agenda and achieve compromises. For this, it's important to remain within the mandate of the chairmanship and to stick to the status-neutral approaches, as they say, and to avoid non-consensus-based wordings, which, in other words, is called embracing the role of an honest broker. However, today we can note that the Polish chairmanship of the OSCE has almost failed in its mission. We're only in the middle of March, though. On the 5th of March, following the talks with the US Secretary of State, Mr. Rao said essentially that the chairpersonship of the OSCE would coordinate the actions against one participating state of the organization. This is an egregious violation by Poland of the mandate of the OSCE chairperson in office adopted at the 2002 Porto Ministerial Council, and also the decisions of the Permanent Council of the OSCE number 485 on public statements. The point of the work of the chairperson in office is precisely to solve disagreements between participating states and to bring positions closer. It is in no way to take biased steps which further inflame confrontation, and especially not to head up an anti-Russian campaign in the OSCE. Today, Mr. Rao and also a number of colleagues stated that Russia apparently has proposed discussing their concerns on security in the OSCE, but it refused. That's not true. We did not refute the Polish chairpersonship proposed dialogue. However, we underscore that for it to be successful, we would need to get responses from the US and individual members of the OSCE as to how they perceive in practice the implementation of the principle, the indivisibility of security. Since we just got some notes, and not from countries, but from the EU and NATO, that we didn't pay attention to properly, that were not taken seriously, or rather, we just got notes, but it wasn't from countries, but it was from the EU and NATO. And we did not contact them regarding these matters. Stating that in the OSCE some kind of helpful dialogue has been started is absolute nonsense. It is the fault of our Western colleagues that the OSCE has not yet been able to deal with important pivotal challenges, achieving a single fundamental understanding of the European security architecture and the indivisibility of that very security. This principle requires avoiding any actions that would strengthen somebody's security to the detriment of the security of any other country. All this is enshrined in many OSCE documents, starting with 1994, when the Code of Conduct for Military Political Sphere was adopted. Then, at the highest level, the European Security Charter of Istanbul was adopted in 1999. In December 2010, at the OSCE summit in Astana, this principle was, in an expanded form, unambiguously confirmed. However, the Western camp made a top priority out of the right of any country to choose its alliance. Regarding the fact that this cannot be done to the detriment of other people's security is something that our colleagues preferred to forget. Today, Mr. Rao said that Russia is requiring unilateral agreements for itself, or guarantees for itself. The detonator for this serious crisis in European security occurring due to the trends I mentioned was the situation in Ukraine. I believe that here as well the OSCE is directly to blame, and the Polish chairmanship who prevented it inter alia through the special representative in the contact group, and the Polish chairmanship is directly to blame too, who prevented it inter alia through the special representative of the contact group to get the Ukrainian side to fully and consistently implement the Minsk package of measures. The scheme of actions was crystal clear, first and foremost to ensure direct dialogue between Kiev, Donetsk and Lugansk, and also to ensure unbiased observance of the situation by the special monitoring mission of the OSCE forces. Its leadership was required to engage in constructive cooperation with the authorities of Donetsk and Lugansk, as stipulated in the mandate of this mission approved by the Permanent Council of the OSCE. In line with this mandate, the mission should not have ignored the violations of human rights and mass media freedom breaches throughout the entire Ukrainian territory, nor failed to notice the blatant facts that attested to the unfurling of aggressive nationalism, neo-Nazism, and the numerous cases of discrimination against the Russian-speaking population. Furthermore, there were gross violations of human rights in Ukraine. Discrimination laws about state language and education and indigenous peoples were adopted, primarily targeted against the Russian language and the millions of Russian-speaking population. Instead of this, we saw that the OSCE blatantly played with the Ukrainian authorities, and they categorically rejected the key provision of Minsk, a direct dialogue with Donbass, preferring to talk to their fellow countrymen living there in the language of guns and shelling. By flagrantly sabotaging its own obligations, Kiev did everything it could to destroy the Minsk agreements. Russia has consistently urged Ukraine to respect the wishes of the inhabitants of Donbass and their legitimate desire to speak in their own language and to teach their children in it, and to honor those who freed these lands from the fascists and not those who fought on the side of Hitler's people and who killed civilians during the Second World War. But Kyiv did not want to hear us. At the same time, the West, headed up by the US, instead of forcing Ukraine to implement its obligations under the Minsk agreements, did everything to goad it, ignoring the sabotage of Minsk. Furthermore, NATO countries pumped Ukraine full of modern weapons and sent military instructors, and in every way helped the militarization of the region. The actions of its Western backers were perceived by Kiev as a carte blanche to conduct military provocations in Donbass. At the end of January-February, the refusal to implement Minsk was stated loud and clear by almost all the senior leadership of Ukraine. And Mr. Kyslytsya confirmed this during the Security Council meeting on the 17th of February. After this, there was a sharp worsening of the situation along the entire contact line. Numerous ceasefire violations were recorded and civilians' homes were shelled, as were schools and other civilian facilities. Unfortunately, this did cause victims. There was a significant increase in the threat of the recurrence of full-scale hostilities like in 2014-2015. The population of the republics encountered the real threat of direct destruction by the Kiev authorities. A wave of refugees poured into our country. As we found out later from documents recovered from Ukrainian soldiers during our military operation, they were given an order to start military actions against LPR and DPR back in March. A copy of these documents are available on the Russian Ministry of Defense site. Our operation hampered these plans. Against Russia, there is now a large-scale information war, and the facilities in the DPR and LPR are shamelessly being portrayed by Western media as the result of our military operation in Ukraine. They are banding about false reports about apparent indiscriminate bombing of Ukrainian towns and cities without any justification whatsoever. There is censorship of the information space, total censorship. In these conditions, receiving objective information about our military operation and also distinguishing blatant fakes of the alleged shelling by Russia of the Mariupol maternity hospital is something that's very difficult for people in Western countries to obtain. Therefore, the untruths bandied about from the Security Council is something we view as a deliberate provocation by our Western colleagues. Currently, the main threat to the civilians in Ukraine is posed by the Ukrainian nationalist armed formations. They have unleashed real terror against their compatriots. There are mass violations of human rights and humanitarian law. Nationalists place tanks, artillery, and multiple rocket launchers directly beside and in kindergartens and schools. They equip firing positions in the roofs of people's homes, and they're hiding behind women and children. Russian soldiers taken prisoner are subject to sadistic torture. Ukrainian bandits video the torture, and the Kiev regime flaunt this brutality. A large number of criminals have been released from prison. A criminal decision was taken by the Kiev regime to distribute tens of thousands of firearms to God knows who. In Kiev alone, this is 10,000. In towns and cities of Ukraine, there's rampaging armed bands of looters and robbers. The bandits are firing at ordinary citizens. We've also recorded broad-scale use by the Kiev regime of phosphorus-filled ammunition. This is counter to the third protocol of the UN Convention dated 1980. And cluster bombs are being used and are being by the Ukrainian army, as I said, and for some reason this is not attracting any attention whatsoever. In these circumstances, the OSCE-CIO, as part of one of its priorities, is to help civilians affected by conflicts. It needs, therefore, to swiftly provide political assistance to the safe evacuation of civilians from the regions of hostilities, to whichever side the Ukrainians themselves want to go to. Russian forces each day unilaterally are opening corridors to evacuate people. However, it's not everybody who can use these corridors. Kiev is not ashamed to threaten its own citizens who are trying to leave towns and cities. Sir, on the 11th of March, we raised in the Security Council the issue of the US bio laboratories in the Ukraine. I'm not going to repeat ourselves, but once again, I'd like to warn about the danger of biomaterials with dangerous strains falling into the hands of Ukrainian radicals. As we've seen, they've proven able to carry out the most horrific provocations against civilians in Ukrainian towns and cities. We're also receiving reports about possible sabotage of gas pipeline systems in Ukraine. Furthermore, according to the information of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, Ukrainian armed formations are actively preparing for active provocations with the use of chemical substances in order to accuse Russia of purportedly using chemical weapons. So on the night of the 9th of March, the Ukrainian nationalists transported to Zolchev, to the northwest of Kharkov, about 80 tons of ammonia. On the 10th of March, the Ukrainian media started to disseminate information about how to protect yourself from a chemical attack. The way in which the thinking is going is no longer in any doubt, especially because our American colleagues, as we repeatedly heard from the lips of the PR of the US in the Security Council, has already given a clue as to who they intend to place the blame on for the dangerous turn of events. If this, God forbid, provocation actually takes place, don't say we didn't warn you. Mr. President, in conclusion, I would like to urge the Chairperson in office to prevent the destruction of the OSCE. It's important not to forget that within it, a number of other topics are discussed which require members of the organization to pay particular attention to, in particular as regards the peaceful and comprehensive settlement of the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. A key role there is played by the OSCE Minsk group. In current circumstances, the OSCE is really the only forum where European-wide dialogue is possible. There's a need to have a think about the historic impact of your actions seeking to undermine any prospects for cooperation in the interests of security of all countries in Europe. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Arab Emirates. At the outset, I would like to thank His Excellency Zbigniew Rau, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland and Chairman in Office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe for 2022, and Undersecretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, for their comprehensive briefings. The UAE supports the role of regional organizations in finding solutions to conflicts, as these organizations have a comprehensive understanding of regional situations and positions. They're also capable of finding common ground to establish regional peace and security. Participating states of regional organizations are usually among the first to be affected by the security, economic, and humanitarian dimensions of the region's crises. As such, reflecting their concerns contributes to reaching comprehensive and realistic solutions. UN Security Council Resolution 1631 has affirmed the role of these organizations and enhanced their cooperation with the United Nations in maintaining international peace and security. We are pleased to see the United Nations strengthening its relations with various regional organizations, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The organization has a long history of working to resolve conflicts and ease tensions in Europe. We believe that its role is essential today, particularly given that Europe is currently facing one of its greatest challenges in the past 2 decades. As we follow the current events engulfing Europe with great concern, we believe we can benefit from the expertise and mediation efforts of the organization to find a solution to the conflict in Ukraine. The role of this organization is also important considering the continued deterioration of the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. This situation has in turn impacted the wider region, especially as Ukrainians search for safety away from conflict, resulting in a growing number of refugees that now exceeds 2.5 million. The organization's role in dealing with the repercussions of this conflict is important, not only at the regional level, but also at the international level. The continuation and worsening of the crisis threaten food security, especially as exports of wheat from Ukraine have stopped. Ukraine is one of the 5 largest exporters of wheat in the world and an important source of wheat for the World Food Programme. This situation will particularly affect developing countries that depend on wheat imports amid an increase in its global prices. In addition to the crisis in Ukraine, participating states of the OSCE have several security and political concerns, including frozen conflicts in Georgia and Moldova, tensions in the Balkan Peninsula, as well as the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. Resolving these tensions requires balanced diplomacy based on a holistic vision that champions dialogue and aims to address existing differences. We rely on the role and experience of the OSCE in mediation, as well as the good offices of the OSCE Chairman in Office to find diplomatic solutions to the region's crises, based on the principles of sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity of states, and maintaining regional security and stability. We also commend the priorities of the Chairman in Office, including the emphasis on compliance with the fundamental principles of peaceful relations among states, that is consistent with the Charter of the United Nations, the Helsinki Final Act, and other relevant international agreements. In conclusion, the UAE commends the important role played by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe as an umbrella institution for various views and concerns across the region. My country, therefore, looks forward to the continued cooperation between the United Nations and the organization in the maintenance of regional and international peace and security. I resume my function as President of the Council. I give the floor to His Excellency Zbigniew Rau to respond to the comments being expressed at the meeting.
Mr. President, Madam Under-Secretary General, distinguished ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this useful and timely debate and for allowing me to participate. I appreciate the interest from the members of the Security Council. Also, I recognize the presence of ambassadors and high-ranking representatives of countries from outside the Security Council, some of them sitting today in the audience and some of them submitting written statements for the record. It is fair to say that the international community is currently at a critical juncture. Even before the current crisis, we saw the erosion of the practical implementation of Helsinki principles and commitments. Today, we should pay special attention to how fundamental UN and OSCE principles are implemented and how to react when those principles are violated. In carrying out my task as the OSCE Chairman in Office, I will be tirelessly calling on all participating states to abide by our joint commitments. I would like to reassure partners that I will not shy away from facilitating dialogue and seeking ways to advance settlement of the ongoing regional and frozen conflicts. As I indicated before, this will exactly be the focus of my upcoming trips to Moldova and the South Caucasus. Later, during the year, I will visit the Western Balkans and Central Asia. The ongoing non-compliance by an OEC participating state may complicate this effort. However, I will do my best to attentively listen to all partners to promote our joint principles and commitments. We will continue to show unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Georgia within its internationally recognized borders. We are determined to keep the conflict around Abkhazia and South Ossetia high on the OEC agenda, as well as seek possibilities to support the communities affected by the conflict. I will make even greater efforts to increase the involvement of the OSCE, the Minsk Group and its co-chairs in resolving the dispute between Azerbaijan and Armenia. We encourage Armenia and Azerbaijan to engage in dialogue aimed at contributing to security, stability and prosperity in the region. In conclusion, let me reiterate that only by reverting to UN and OEC principles, we will be able to ease tensions and prevent military conflicts in the future. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rao for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President, OEC Chairman in Office, Madam Under-Secretary General, distinguished colleagues, and we have no doubt who sits in the Soviet seat behind the nameplate Russian Federation. The General Assembly gave a clear answer to this question. It is the aggressor state, not a shred of doubt. I would like to start with expressing my gratitude to the OEC Chairman in Office for his briefing and in particular for his clear qualification of the Russian actions against Ukraine as unprovoked and unjustified aggression, which runs counter both the UN Charter and the Helsinki Final Act, all OEC commitments and principles. Minister Rao, welcome to our regular intervention meetings, where members of the UN family gather around the aggressor state who is in denial and makes no effort to struggle with its addiction to killing innocent citizens. Indeed, both the UN and the OEC are now at the critical juncture with all their fundamental principles being violated, flagrantly, openly, and deliberately. Violated by Russia, that has pretended to be a key stakeholder in maintaining international peace and security. Instead, it has been a main provider of insecurity, encircling itself with a belt of conflicts. On the 24th of February, Russia went even further, launching an aggressive war against Ukraine, the war that serves an illustration of what the UN founding members and Russia was not in their list, a reminder to try to save succeeding generations from. I therefore commend the chairman in office for his strong commitment to pursue as his main priority the termination of the war on the basis of respect to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We fully support human-oriented approach of Poland's OSCE chairmanship with a special focus on protection of the civilian population affected by conflicts. Russian troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine, erasing any difference with their Nazi predecessors 80 years ago. Cities and villages destroyed to the ground, mass graves, terror against civilians in the occupied territories, abduction and killing of representatives of local authorities, activists and journalists. I reiterate my call on the Security Council and today address this call to the OSCE chair, as well to facilitate release of Ivan Fedorov, mayor of Melitopol, Zaporizhia region, who was detained by the Russian soldiers on 11th of March. Now he is reportedly tortured due to his refusal to collaborate with the aggressor. Unfortunately, the Russian occupants step up their repressive practices, as yesterday they abducted Yevhen Matveyev, mayor of Dnipro-Rudne, another town in Zaporizhia region. Russia proceeds with repressive practices as it has completely failed to create an illusion of public support on the territories it temporarily occupies. Residents of Kherson, Berdyansk, Melitopol, Energodar, and other cities and towns in occupation have no fear to take to the streets to say to the occupants, "Go away, we are Ukraine," unarmed, staring down the barrel of a Russian gun. Russian attempts to employ in Kherson its usual practice of proclaiming a fake People's Republic was immediately rejected by the Kherson Regional Council that adopted at its emergency session on the 12th of March a statement that Kherson region has been and will be Ukraine. The mayor of Kherson solidarized with this statement. There is no place in Ukraine where the Russian troops are welcome. They feel it quite well and they have stopped restraining themselves. Mariupol remains the most powerful example. The toll of civilian casualties following Russian bombardments and shellings reached almost 2,200 innocent local residents. If you want to visualize it, just think of at least 11 General Assembly halls. So many citizens were killed in Mariupol. Early on Sunday morning, Russian rockets struck the Yavoriv International Peacekeeping and Security Center. 35 people were killed and 134 wounded. Russian Ministry of Defense tried to whitewash this crime by claiming it aimed the foreign mercenaries. This is not true, as only Ukrainian citizens were affected. Countering Russian aggression must be a centerpiece of the OSCE efforts to restore security in the European continent. We consider that the OSCE has to contribute to the implementation of the resolution ES/11-1, aggression against Ukraine, adopted by the overwhelming majority on the 2nd of March. We welcome the invocation of the Moscow mechanism, which is important to register all war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Russian Federation in its war against Ukraine. We also underline the need to explore all OSCE tools to document Russian crimes and ensure public and timely reaction by the Chairperson in office, special representatives, and the OSCE autonomous institutions. We expect the ODIHR to be vocal on the cases of flagrant human rights violations stemming from the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Russia is intensifying its propaganda and disinformation campaign, and we consider that the OEC representative on freedom of the media has to pay close attention to Russia's false narratives. We appreciate her strong stance against violations against journalists, which remains an element of the Russian aggression. We note her condemnation of killing of Brent Renault, a US filmmaker and journalist, in Irpin on the 13th of March. I quote, "He is another casualty of the horrible ongoing Russian invasion in Ukraine, and his death is a blow to media freedom," end of quote. I also express our profound condolences to the relatives of Ms. Maria Fenina of SMM, who was killed by the aggressor. Strong and clear position by the High Commissioner for National Minorities on dire conditions of national minorities in Ukraine stemming from the Russian invasion remains long overdue. He also has to be proactive on rebutting Russia's propaganda fakes. We also look forward to extending the OEC SMM mandate for another year. It would be a powerful message of the OEC engagement with Ukraine. I would like to thank at this point the Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her very principled position, for her being a very strong member of the Secretary General's team. And on this occasion, I would like to quote the Secretary General's statement that he made less than an hour ago, and I quote, "Ukraine is on fire. The country is being decimated before the eyes of the world. The impact on civilians is reaching terrifying proportions. Countless innocent people, including women and children, have been killed after being hit by Russian forces. Roads, airports, and schools lie in ruins. According to the WHO, at least 24 health facilities have been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are without water or electricity. With each passing hour, two things are increasingly clear. First, it keeps getting worse. Second, whatever the outcome, this war will have no winners, only losers." Then the Secretary General also wisely said, "Yet there is another dimension of this conflict that gets obscured. This war goes far beyond Ukraine. It is also an assault on the world's most vulnerable people and countries. While war reigns over Ukraine, a sword of Damocles hangs over the global economy, especially the developing world. Even before the conflict, developing countries were struggling to recover from the pandemic, with record inflation, rising interest rates, and looming debt burdens. Their ability to respond has been erased by exponential increases in the cost of financing. Now their bread basket, that's Ukraine, is being bombed." End of quote. Dear colleagues, what is happening now is not only about Ukraine's survival. Unlike Putin and his henchmen, Ukraine will survive the Russian invasion. It's about survival of both the UN and the OEC. And it is about deputinization of Russia and its gradual returning to the tenets of international law in the post-Putin era. The Putin's regime nears its end. At the same time, it has inflicted such a heavy damage on the Russian society that it would take decades to bring Russia back to at least the level of democracy it achieved in the 90s of the past century. In fact, Moscow required 15 years to cover distance between formal signing of the Helsinki Final Act and conscious choice to be a part of building a new Europe as envisaged in the 1990 Paris Charter. Eventually, Moscow failed. And yet we deem that now the OSCE should play a special role in getting ready to support post-Putin Russia on its future path back to the family of democratic nations under new leadership, with new ambassadors and new representatives. It's not an easy task, but we will not be able to break the vicious circle of violence without restoring respect by Russia of the fundamental principles enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act. I therefore call upon the OSCE Chair and the OSCE autonomous institutions to start considering the modalities of work with post-Putin Russia, as there will be no automatic return to normalcy, neither here in New York nor in the OSCE. And I thank you.
أشكر ممثل أوكرانيا على بيانه.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.